All for joining us for the 14th annual Caroline and H. McCoy Jones Memorial Lecture. I'm Laura Camerlingo. I'm curator in charge of costume and textile arts, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the DeYoung Museum. This lecture is named in honor of Caroline and H. McCoy Jones. H. McCoy Jones was a scholar, collector of nomadic tribal rugs, and founder of the International Haji Baba Society, a nonprofit dedicated to the understanding and appreciation of fine textiles. In 1980, he and his wife Caroline made the commitment to donate more than 600 Central Asian carpets and textiles to the museums. This gift transformed the museums into one of the greatest repositories of Central Asian textiles in the United States. After H. McCoy's death in 1987, Caroline expanded her husband's collection, focusing on Central Asian and South American textiles, and gifted significant collections of Anatolian kilims and global headwear. Their estate was officially gifted to the department in 2006, and if you wish to learn more about this collection, please visit our website. We are honored to have with us today Amanda Phillips, Associate Professor at the University of Virginia. Dr. Phillips began teaching at the University of Virginia in 2015, after earning a doctorate at Oxford and completing fellowships in Berlin and Birmingham. Her first book, Everyday Luxuries, was published in 2016 and explores early modern ceramics, silks, embroideries, carpets, arts of the book, and other objects. Her second book, Sea Changed, published in 2021, was shortlisted for the Textile Society of America's R.L. Shep Prize. It focuses on Ottoman textiles, from luxury silks to humble cottons. One of her current projects looks at towel weaving between Istanbul and Manchester, and another considers embroidery in the global 18th century. Her lecture today addresses the making, exchange, and use of textiles in the Ottoman Empire. Indeed, textiles touched every level of Ottoman society. Lively trade with Italy, Iran, and India was complemented by the huge array of textiles made within the empire's bounds. In this talk, Dr. Phillips offers a series of object studies, while also considering how different types of textiles interact. It begins with a hanging made for a sultan around 1400, moves on to velvet weaving in Bursa, and ends with an 18th century Barber's apron from our museum's collection. Please give her a warm welcome to the museums.
So, thank you. Thank you, Laura. That was really generous. And thanks for all coming out on this Saturday afternoon. It's great to be here. Thanks also to the whole team that helped put this together. It is a big effort. So, here we are, beginning of March. I'll be talking really, again, mostly about Ottoman textiles and really mostly highly decorative silks. Again, I'll start with a big hanging made for a sultan around the year 1400. It is a unicum, meaning, yes, unique, and therefore difficult to compare to anything else. We'll then move on to velvets made in large quantities, and with this we can and will compare to those from Italy, those from Ottoman Empire, those made for elites, and those made for humbler folks too. And wrapping up, a last look at an Ottoman embroidery, namely the shaving apron and an accompanying towel made in the late 1700s. For these objects, for a few others, I'll be coming back to themes about the transfer of complex technologies and the potentials of technologies, about how textiles were part of social and economic life. Also, about what objects can tell us about the way they were made and about whom and for whom. So, historical context. The Ottoman sultans, part of Turkic groups that had made their way west from Inner Asia. For the Ottomans themselves, we tend to think about the year 1290 for the first clear evidence of their presence in Anatolia. These early Ottoman rulers allied themselves with other groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. They made conquests into Southeast Europe. And so you have the tiny orange spot on that map becoming ever larger and more colorful. Over the next century or so, the Ottoman Empire expanded. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Territories eventually included Iraq, Syria, Egypt, parts of western Iran, and the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Those conquests, of course, meant Ottoman control over the Red Sea to Mediterranean routes and land routes as well. But today, I'll really be talking about Western Anatolia and its connections to the north-northwest, meaning the Balkans, and to the northwest, meaning Italy. And so starting here with the Balkans. This is the Oliva silk, a massive textile with inscriptions that name the Sultan Bayezid I, who died in 1403. It arrived at the Studenica Monastery in central Serbia at some point in the 17th or 18th centuries. Before that, it had moved around other Serbian monasteries, probably since about 1410 or so. Now, its histories as it moved around those monasteries in Serbia is now being explored by a colleague. It requires far more expertise in church sources than I have. So here we are with the inscriptions that name the sultans. And art historians, we love objects with any kind of text because they seem to tell us so much. In this case, the fact that it was made in honor of Sultan Bayezid. Now, the upper phrase in the slide is generic, right? It refers only to a wise and just sultan. The lower phrase names Sultan Bayezid Khan himself and wishes him glorious victories. Now, the language here is Arabic, which is typical for this kind of inscription, even though Bayezid himself would have used a type of Anatolian Turkish. Bayezid is called Sultan. He's also called Khan, as in Genghis Khan. And a little more context here. The Oliva silk is the earliest surviving Ottoman textile, we think. It is one of very few textiles from this time and region to survive intact. It has not been cut down, nor is it a patchwork made from multiple objects, and we can really see this if we look carefully at the end finishes in that upper detail, namely these rows of trefoils, which are carefully designed and again placed only at the top and bottom. Also, the selvages are intact. That for that main piece, they're visible, and it gives us loom width as well, which is actually really big, so more than 1 meter across in its main field. And the inscriptions. So, if we look carefully at the text, but beyond the meaning of the words themselves, there are several features that complicate our ideas about its commission. So now, bear with me here. I'm going to go through this as carefully as I can, but also not trying your patience too much. So look up at the top. There's a generic blessing, right? It uses fairly evenly spaced script, right? It does, at the end of the phrase, dislocate a couple of letters to an upper register, and that is absolutely normal for this kind of inscription. Note also, I'm going to see if I can use my mouse here. Well, look at that upper inscription and look at the uprights and see that they have little caps on them. Those are serifs, right? It's the word we use in English. So little flag-like caps on the top of the letters. And then compare the lower phrase, which names Bayezid himself. Now, the writing is really smushed toward the end of that phrase. Not just a letter or two in the upper register, but a whole last word sort of wedged in there. Also, note on those uprights, no serifs. And also a slightly different kind of drawing in the taud letter. That's the T in Sultan. So hold this thought. Now, in terms of textile structure, this is a figured compound weave, and as such, it was woven on a draw loom equipped with a pattern harness. This type of machine and device were widespread across Eurasia at this moment around 1400. So now, this is a textile lecture, and so I'm going to go into a little bit the weaving technology here. So again, a draw loom equipped with pattern harness. It has 2 sets of warps, 2 sets of wefts, a type of structure known as a lampus. It's the crossings of these warps and wefts that make the motifs. All of this worked out ahead of time by a specialist. This specialist understood, too, how these crossings of warp and weft would repeat over and over to build into the repeating motifs and eventually the pattern. These crossings of warp and weft were mapped out ahead of time onto a thread model. That represents the motifs that are repeated over and over to create the whole. The repetition along both vertical and horizontal is permitted by something called the pattern harness, which is mounted on the loom, and it controls a second set of warps. Those second set of warps, held in the patterning harness, are raised by a second worker. He lifts warp selections, meaning many warps at once, in a sequence, meaning that once a weft is passed, over and over, begins to generate motifs. So a second worker using a pre-programmed device to make the motifs. Now, the advantage of this kind of loom setup is twofold. First, because warp selections were predetermined, entered together into the harness, all the warps in a selection could be raised at once. So this is not finger picking, this is not like tapestry or kilim weaving. It's fast, relatively. Second advantage, exact repeats every time because of our pre-programming. For the Oliva silk, the most important thing now is how the motifs work together within each band and then how the bands create the whole. So note the repeating units within the bands from right to left. They are the same length. The horizontal dimensions of these motifs within the bands cannot be altered without changing the whole loom setup. Pattern harness, thread model, all of the mounting. By contrast, the bands themselves, all the way across, could be swapped in and out at will during weaving without altering the setup. All the second worker had to do was activate a different set of warp selections, and this is because of the sequential nature of weaving. So, to give you an idea of how this banded format works on a loom, as seen here, the warp selection that makes each band all the way across activated in sequence. The weaver and drawboy activate the second set of warps to make the bands here. And again, try to use a mouse. Bear with me. Look at those bands. Think about them. You see bands, but you also see plain areas as well. So during weaving, to make the plain areas, they don't activate that second set of warps, but when they want to insert a whole band, they activate the necessary second set of warps. They can make 5 bands in a row, they can make 3, they can make 1, and this they can decide on the fly. This is the flexibility afforded by the draw loom and pattern harness in combination and then coupled with the banded format. So again, bands can be swapped, but the motifs within the bands from left to right cannot be changed without altering the whole thing. So, when we think about the Bayezid textile, the phrase naming Bayezid, of course, is a motif. The writing is scrunched up because it was forced into the same dimensions as the other repeating motifs within the bands. And look at this, you can see how this happened. There you have written there in modern Arabic font, you see it. The phrase naming Bayezid is way longer than that generic phrase. So my hypothesis is the band that names Bayezid was created to fit into an already existing repeating system. The size of the individual motifs, the inscriptions within that band, had to therefore conform to existing dimensions. So it's an addition to something that was already created or already in use. The interpolation of this new band, well, it means there's no need to create a whole new design and to remount the loom. That is a huge savings in time. It takes weeks, months to mount a loom. It's a savings in expertise. But when we think about how scrunched up it looks, maybe the result is less than perfectly harmonious. So of course this begins to raise other questions. It's a huge textile. It's a luxury good, but was it a rush order? Was it something that had to be expedited in honor of an event, such as a marriage, a victory, a new alliance? Was it perhaps ordered in the aftermath of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when Bayezid became Sultan and sealed the alliance with a marriage to the Serbian princess, namely Oliva? In all cases, though, it is not quite a totally custom design for our Sultan, so royal prestige is perhaps slightly undermined by the need to expedite the order. Now, this is an unusual object. It's not even that well known among, sort of Islamic textile enthusiasts. So I'm going to take you through some of its motifs in a better view. So first, cloud bands, right? Ultimately really from Chinese art, but filtered through that of Central Asia and Persia. Then a sort of, generic floral pattern. Note the split leaves, also called Rumi leaves, typical of Islamic art in many media, woodwork, ceramics, etc. Relatively thicker band uses a black star and octagon pattern on a gold ground, and this band, I think, was probably modeled on an all-over knotwork pattern, but the motifs here have become detached from one another. Another floral meander, and I think here you can see one of these is a lotus blossom. You can see it, the flower represented in profile with that little sort of pearl shape in the middle that lets us know what it is. And then last, these red bands with the sort of mandorlas, which are most often repeated in the textile, and a detail to show the weave structure for those of you who are interested. So taken as a whole too, and maybe visible especially in this image, the textile itself shows us that the workshop had a competent designer, a competent calligrapher, but maybe a second calligrapher at some remove who is maybe a little bit less so, or at least had to undertake an impossible task, right? The workshop, you can see that here, had access to high-quality dyed silk, to gold thread with a high proportion of precious metal, and this textile is still glittery after about 600 years. You see that. So if my hypothesis is correct, if that second band with Bayezid was sort of inserted here, it is a workshop that is already operating that receives this commission. So what we make of that, I'm not sure. But a corollary point, again, seen here. Not just the workshop, the textile really shows us the other types of labor involved here, right? People raising silkworms, reeling, dyeing, twisting, making gold foil-wrapped thread. Also, of course, the designer, the weaver, the weaver's assistant. You can take that right back to building the loom and mining the gold and silver. The work of many in this case. And speaking of labor, I would just say work like this my hypothesis about the student eats the silk, whether it's right or not, even this kind of research, even this kind of hypothesis, right, it's not done solo. I had so much help undertaking this research, that of about 6 institutions in Serbia, really excellent colleagues there. The abbot of the monastery, certainly a fantastic photographer too, as well as funding from the British Academy. So not cheap, quick, or easy. Continuing with labor and expertise. The Studenica silk may have been made in an Ottoman city, but working across the Ottoman territories were people who came there from the Morea in Greece, from Iran, from the old Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, from Aleppo and Damascus, and from Italy. And our theme here is complex technologies. Complex technologies such as weaving on draw looms with pattern harnesses, these are introduced to new places, new centers, only when artisans themselves move. Weavers don't dream up these processes overnight. They don't stumble upon them. They don't learn them in passing. So, keeping in mind this idea about artisan migration and transfer of technology, let's move on to our bigger category of surviving Ottoman textile, figured velvets. Now, in textile terms, we call this type in English voided and brocaded velvet. In Ottoman Turkish, we call them Chatma. These are all warp pile velvets. That means that the little tufts that make the plush surface, that's the definition of velvet, right? The plush surface. Those little tufts are made from warp threads that have been looped over a small rod during weaving and then usually cut. So, similar to the Oliva silk, Chatmas are woven on draw looms equipped with pattern harnesses. And the pattern harness operates in pretty much the same way. In this case, though, it's the warps that make the pile. It's those warps that are lifted by the second worker, and lifted, lowered, and cut. So in this case, for warp pile velvets, the motifs are made by contrasting areas with and without pile. So if you look up in this slide, the piled areas are the darker crimson, the unpiled area are the lighter color. You're seeing the facing, the foundation weave of the fabric. In some cases, in this one, the weaver himself has added a gold thread in some of those left bare areas, a gold thread to emphasize some motifs, and that's the brocaded part of this. So this general category of velvet, voided and brocaded, was woven in quantity from the 1400s into the 1500s, in the Ottoman Empire, yes, in various cities in Italy, probably Central Asia, maybe also Syria and Egypt. By around 1500 or so, velvet weaving had spread with artisans to many places. In the Ottoman Empire, the city of Bursa in the Marmara region, it's actually right in the middle there with that orange bit, right? We associate Bursa with Chatma weaving. Other places made it too. Now, some of our evidence for Chatma weaving in Bursa comes from archival sources. In the year 1462, for instance, a record made in Bursa's Sharia court mentions a loom for making Chatma that was being sold already set up for use, so probably with warps and pattern harness attached. A few years later, a similar record mentions a loom for plain silk velvet. In the year 1501, something different, a major imperial inquiry into silk weaving in Bursa, undertaken by Sultan Bayezid II, his ministers, and the Qadi. They take textile workers to task for corner cutting and bad practice. This includes velvet weavers. The textile workers, as a collective, were accused of defrauding the innocent customer. The central authorities, the Qadi and Bursa, generate reams of similar written sources over the centuries to come. So you might ask, why Bursa? And it's partly answered here with that little orange spot. The city had been an early Ottoman capital in the 14th century. It's also important because it's a terminus of the silk routes coming from northwest Iran. In order to facilitate silk selling there, the sultans, their ministers, their bureaucrats set up market, storage facilities, and tax collection points there. This slide is the Kozahan, the interior of it, commissioned by Sultan Bayezid II around the year 1490. It was specifically designated to provide storage and office space, more or less, for silk traders and especially for non-Ottoman merchants, namely foreign merchants coming from, among other places, Iran and Italy. So among the written sources we have for this period around 1500 are letters from the Florentine agents of the Medici family. The agents may have, in fact, had office space in just this Han. In one letter, in fact, the Medici agent in Bursa mentions an Italian silk weaver living there and working too. But also in Bursa, of course, there were Ottoman subjects who'd been moved from southeastern Europe and men and women from Iraq, Iran, Syria, and elsewhere. It was a big city and it was a busy city. And this is where we come, of course, to artisan migration and the transfer of technology. Ottoman Chatma, as we see in this example, these are complicated weave structures made with complex technology. And so this is a somewhat later piece. You see the microscope-aided detail on the right, and you can see the weave structure here. So note in particular the two different colors of pile or plush coming up from the foundation of the fabric. Note also the metal weft going back and forth to fill the empty areas. And maybe just behind that metal weft, you can see, just behind it, a series of warps that creates really the true foundation. And this is a high quality example. Rich colors, high thread count, shiny metal. And also in the fragment really, it is a specific type. It is a cushion cover, so keep this in mind. So with Bursa, then we ask a second question. When did Chatma weaving start? Well, we can probably rule out continuation of local practices in the pre-Ottoman history. There was plain silk weaving, there was fine silk embroidery, there's cotton weaving and the like in the 13th and 14th centuries in Anatolia and Bursa, but there's just no evidence of velvet weaving. If we hypothesize that the Studenitsa silk was made, or the Olivera silk was made in Western Anatolia, then there is at least a little bit of evidence that at some point there was at least one workshop with a draw loom and pattern harness, around 1400 or so. Fair enough. These were made, again, with draw looms and pattern harnesses. But it is also figured velvet, right? The Chatma is figured velvet as a fabric. The motifs are created by the plush, and the plush requires another piece of specialized equipment, namely the warp creel. It sits behind the loom, and it allows the warp threads, the plush warp threads, to unspool at uneven rates. This is important, right? Because all those little tufts that make the plush take up a ton of warp material, and they take it up irregularly. Those plush areas are unevenly distributed across the surface of the fabric to make the motifs. Scholars have recently posited that while plain velvets, which did not require a full creel setup, may have been made in several centers around the year 1150, around the year 1200, figured velvets that require this warp creel may have originated as a type in northern China or Central Asia sometime between 1250 and 1300. So this argument is based on textiles coming out of quasi-archaeological contexts in that region. So for Ottoman Bursa, maybe the question becomes, with whom did Chatma weaving arrive? Was expertise introduced by weavers who came there seeking their fortunes? Maybe they were Venetian, Genoese, Florentine. Maybe they came from Iran or Syria. So, setting aside questions about transfer of technology, the close visual connections between Ottoman and Italian velvets in the late 1400s, first part of the 1500s, are undeniable. A preference for this deep crimson pile ground with elegant interlaced leaves and vines in both. Pomegranates, compound blossoms, palmettes, and these long serrated leaves we see in both examples, sometimes called rumi leaves, and distantly related to the smaller scale motifs in the Oliva silk. Now, these overall designs are complex in their conception. The vines and the leaves, stems operate on two planes crossing over and under, and arguably, I would think, a little bit more complex in the Ottoman example. Perhaps more striking, but less complex in conception, is this type. So we're still with the crimson and gold, but here crisscrossing stem serrated leaves, in this case terminating in these massive palmettes and pairs of flowers. Weavers added, again, an extra gold weft only in selected areas to highlight centers of motifs. And rumi leaf, yes, still here too, but much smaller in this cases. And I guess it's an open question at this point. This may be an Italian version, it may be an Ottoman version, and only close analysis will tell. So, moving along with our velvets into the 1550s, we add Safavid or Iranian examples into our comparisons. So here, again, some similarities in format, in this case between Iran and the Ottoman Empire. Staggered medallions linked by thick stems or leaves. And note, too, that the motifs are directional. These velvets are, in this slide, right side up, and you can tell it especially for the Safavid one because of those birds. And the Ottoman Empire is definitely well used, right? And that can sort of lets us see what is going on behind the velvet pile. It's been worn away somewhat and exposes what I think is probably a red silk foundation, and I'm going to be able to check this when I see it in person. But another general point for both of these, they use two colors of velvet pile, right? Red and gold is sort of a golden yellow color for the Ottoman, and crimson and sort of a blue color for the Safavid. So keep this idea of two colors of velvet pile in mind. So again, we associate the Ottoman example with Bursa, that it was definitely possible. It could have been woven elsewhere. And with keeping that in mind, I want to turn to a last velvet, also here in the collection at the museum. So this is a humbler object indeed, and this is a little misleading, right? I blew it up so you could see it, but it's also a good deal smaller. It's hard to get a sense of scale. It's a less complex composition as well. You could call those rumi leaves if you wanted to. The colors, I think, are a little obviously less lustrous. And if we look closely, or even maybe not that closely, we can see it only has one color of velvet pile. Note also that the areas with no pile, so that's sort of tan ones, are, again, tan. So no metal weft. So from what I can tell, and I'll confirm this again, I hope, next week, the weavers added only the metal weft only in very certain small places. And if you look, again, really closely in those little circles at the edges of that main motif, you can sort of see like a little shadow. It's maybe a little bit gray, and that's sort of the ghosts of some of the metal brocading weft that had been added, but again, only in certain places. By contrast, that pile has held up pretty well. So this one we see here is also that specific format. The end finishes, which we call lappets sometimes, turn it into a discrete type of object rather than just a length or a random piece. The same general type of the fragment we saw earlier. And again, what was it? It was a cushion cover, and it would have been used in this direction. Now, in textile studies, we have a tendency, right? We study, we publish with the warps in the up and down position, right, as they would have been on a loom. But of course, a finished fabric could be used any way the customer chose. In this case, meant to sit on the back of a bench or a low sofa. So the term used in Ottoman Turkish sources for cushion cover is yastık yüzü. And a lot of them, these yastık yüzü, are described as Chatma, so voided and brocaded velvet, often described too as coming from Bursa. And other kinds of corroborating evidence tells us that many of this type in particular were woven there in the year 1641. An Ottoman traveler wrote that a big proportion of Bursa's population was involved in one facet or another of making velvet cushion covers. An Austrian traveler in the 1810s writes the same thing. And an anonymous Ottoman artist included cushion covers in this illustration from 1728. This is an episode from a moralizing tale by the Ottoman author Nevizade Atayi. So for Chatma cushion covers in particular, the convergence of terminology, the abundance of extant objects, it's really useful because it lets us trace the category in written sources and in visual sources. In this painting, for instance, right? And this painting neatly confirms our ideas that some of these textiles are destined for an urban upper middle class. So not the sultans, not the high elites, but anyone who had a little disposable income. Written sources also tell us that Chatma cushion covers were made in workshops, and the men, and it was mostly men, who wove them, organized themselves into cooperatives, a little bit like guilds. The heads of these cooperatives used the city's Sharia courts to set terms for training apprentices. For instance, it took 5 years to become a master Chatma weaver. They also went to the judge at the Sharia court to register what kind of dyes and silks and thread counts they should use and more. The heads of the cooperatives also defended themselves against accusations from groups of other craftsmen, from the market inspector, from other folk as well. And these accusations were usually about the fact that they were making poor quality goods out of substandard materials and reducing thread count as well. So, in one case, weavers of Chatma cushion covers were accused by other kinds of velvet weavers for substituting cotton for the silk they had been using. This cotton would have been the weft, which is usually hidden behind a facing of silk, and that's the tan in this case. And this is a detail from a different cushion cover that shows, in fact, the cotton threads peeking through. The surface sometimes get damaged, and we can see. And here in this slide, in the details, a couple of other examples of disallowed practice, things you were not supposed to do according to the guild, the cooperative, and the Sharia court, according to the standards set and agreed upon. Now, in the case of the cotton wefts, the Chatma weavers, the Chatma cushion cover weavers, argued back. They said that cushion covers were a special category, a category in which it was permitted to use cotton thread as a weft. The expert witnesses supported them, and the judge ruled in their favor. So reading between the lines, the weavers are arguing about making a less expensive fabric. Cotton, of course, costs a small fraction of silk. Its price is less volatile. Think also about how thick these cotton threads are. They're usually doubled in a single pass. So this allows weavers to build length more quickly as they work. So using a cotton weft, it's cheaper and it reduces completion time. Cotton is also well suited for upholstery. Most of these were cushions, right? It can be stiffer than silk, especially when tightly woven. So a last technical point about Chatmas. In our Chatma cushion cover, there's only one color of pile, right? No crimson, none of these extra details in green or gold and yellow as with the length. And now, you might not think at first glance that leaving out just some small details in a second color of pile would make a big savings in material. But again, these are silk velvets, they are warp piled. Those little tufts are made out of warps. And we're talking about a bunch of creels and silk thread that absorbs all the silk that's getting absorbed into the tufts of the plush surface. Warp threads, by their nature, cannot be easily added or taken out during weaving. They run through the whole textile. That's what's being held taut on the loom. So a second color of velvet pile requires a full second set of warp threads that run all the way through the textile, all the way up and down, even if only a little bit is ever used on the front. So a one-colored velvet uses far less of the expensive material than a two-colored velvet, even if the fabric is about the same size, about the same shape and weave structure and style. Chatmas of a single color were permitted by the rules of the Sharia court, by the cooperative itself, as long as their sale price reflected this. And there's the key point. Many of the rulings in the Sharia court are about fairness and about especially protecting the consumer by offering or guaranteeing value for money. If the Chatma cushion uses one color of velvet pile, if it uses cotton wefts instead of silk, maybe it was a little smaller, all of this was okay if it was reflected in the price. So cheap, quick, and easy. Now, joking aside, maybe this is a little bit of a risky thing to say in a fine arts museum. Art historians have tended not to like so much what they see as imperfect crafts, those which might be legitimately considered lower quality, lacking the shimmer of opulence, the immediate and magical power of beauty. But let me make a case for our Chatma cushion cover. What it shows us is the great ingenuity of the weavers as they make a case for themselves in the Sharia court and in the market. They weave goods for those maybe with shallower pockets. They maneuver their materials as they deal with rising prices and shortages of silk and metal. They justify it, they articulate it to the judge. So this is the sign of a very healthy craft sector indeed. Adaptability, flexibility, vertical integration. So Islamic art, Ottoman textiles, Ottoman art, it's not just about imperial decrees and palace workshops. So last object for today's talk, and I will cover this at high speed. So with our apron and towel, we do remain in commercial workshops, though I think we do return to our shimmer of beauty. So these are often referred to as barber's aprons or shaving aprons. According to research by colleagues at the Sadberk Hanım Museum in Istanbul, these apron and towel sets were gifts given to grooms by their fiancés in the days before a wedding. The apron was worn by the groom during the ceremony, a sort of a celebratory pre-wedding shave made in the company of male friends and family. And we should probably discard, in this case and others, any idea that these were worked in sort of a homey, domestic atmosphere by an enthusiastic but slightly skilled bride-to-be. The workshop project, right? Finely woven good silk, quantity of metal thread, exactly repeating floral motifs. And this workshop probably did work on commission, but also certainly their clients were selecting from a number of templates as well. And this photo, in fact, shows the back of the apron. It would have, of course, been draped across the front to protect the wearer from lather and water from the shave, and then it would have been fastened in the back. So we're seeing sort of in the upper part of this two layers, right? This is a little bit like the smock most of us would put on at the hairdresser. And really, I'm coming to the end, right? I promise. 2 last small points. The first is about the floral motifs. These maybe pansies placed in nosegays, held together with bows at the bottom. So these are discrete, they're scattered regularly across a plain field. And we are more than 2 centuries on from those scrolling vines and layers of complex motifs from the Ottoman and Italian velvets. But this embroidered apron is really also part of a widespread fashion, in this case, the global rage for floral decoration, which was well underway by the end of the 1700s. And so, last, arriving at what makes textiles unique as a category of object. This was a gift, perhaps somewhat freighted, part of the unofficial rituals of marriage. Putting on this garment was a signal about the transformation of the wearer's state, from unshaven to shaven, most obviously, but also from single to married. And it would be a delight to wear and a token of regard that would be carefully kept for generations. And that's why we have the set here in 2024. So I will end on this note. Textiles do a lot. They shape our bodies and our memories, but they also show us about the potentials and transfers of technology, mastery of skill, ideas about use and consumption, about the size and endurance of the textile sector, about how textiles also shape the environment itself with silk, cotton, and metal components. More than that, though, I hope that every part of this talk has argued that textiles are important. And I leave you with that, maybe as the only takeaway. Thank you. I think that there is time, I believe, for a couple of questions. So I'll answer that one first. What made me interested in textiles? I think this is for the folks who are streaming. Man, I'm going to admit, I talk about the workshops and the flexibility of the weavers. It was the shimmer of opulence. Absolutely. They are great looking. And then as a topic of study, I sort of wrapped up with it. You can do anything with textiles, right? It can take you from archaeology to the history of technology. It can take you into consumption studies. It can take you into fashion as well. So the world is open when you study textiles. And that's why I've stuck with it.
So I'm going to squeeze in 2 questions because I'm cheating. One is, if you could talk a little bit about the patterns of where this makes sense on this one, that it might be folded, but on the first textile, there were almost like more regular patterns of wear and disintegration. That's one question, and the other question, when you get back to the first textile, is whether the motifs carried through on hand embroideries and other crafts of like at the same time.
Okay, so there are 2 questions. The first one about, I think, wear patterns and folding on a couple of these. So this one and then the first one, and then going to the first one, which I'm going to clarify. That was the Oliva silk. Yeah, about wear patterns there, but then also embroidery, whether we... Okay, so you can clarify. I'm going to start. So I think, yes, that the silk, in the case of the towel here, probably disintegrated a little bit because this was folded, right? This, again, from what I can tell, this is photographed. This is a 3-dimensional object, right? This shaving apron. So we're seeing actually the back of it. We're seeing the part that came over the back, and then the back part of the what would have been over the front. So yes, I also looked at this and I thought part of it was faded at first, but it's a function of sort of a back front photography in this case. Does that make sense? Yeah. So a very fine silk fabric which sort of fell apart along the fold line in this case. Now I'm going to go back the best I can to the Oliva silk. So wear patterns here, or dirt patterns here. Right, so this silk, I saw this in 2018. I went back 2 years ago and it had been cleaned. So it looks a lot better. But those wear patterns might have told us something if we could have maybe analyzed them. And I'm going to go actually scoot way forward, daringly, to talk about how this textile might have been placed in the monastery of Studenica. There is some speculation that it was placed over the cenotaph of Stefan Nemanja. He's the founder of the Serbian royal line. His cenotaph is there. The idea is this textile was draped over that cenotaph, which is in the monastery's main cathedral, and that it was a relic. So people touched the textile and touched it especially along one side, the side facing into the main part of the cathedral. This is speculative. There is very good evidence that the textile was a slightly different kind of relic before it came to Studenica itself, that it had been used to wrap, shall we say, other relics that were circulating between different Serbian royal foundations. So this is a very long way of saying that sort of wear and dirt patterns on textiles can also really help us understand their later lives, so the points after manufacturing. And I'm going to clarify that, sorry, there was another question about whether, was it these motifs or any motifs translated into embroidery?
Yeah, that's right. Whether the weaving patterns and embroidery carried over into other like hand embroidery or other motifs, or they kind of followed separate paths.
I'll answer quickly for this textile. There's just very little evidence for embroidery from this period, so I can't do a good job with that, I'm afraid. Now, there is, for sort of some of the later Ottoman textiles, there are some strong links between the woven textiles and the embroideries and the loom woven motifs. We usually sort of assume that it starts with a loom woven motif and it makes its way into embroidery, which is a much freer, much less technologically driven way of creating design. But that's a very general answer.
First, I just want to thank you so much for the lecture. I found it to be absolutely fascinating, not only talking about textile, but also the history. The Studenica silk, I really appreciated how you drew attention to the many hands and the many professions that went into making this piece. That, you know, it's not just what you see, but the amount of effort that went into making this and the amount of coordination and collaboration between different professions, which I think is absolutely fascinating. You had mentioned with the cushions that those were woven by men. I'm wondering, with this silk piece, do you know anything about the gender of the weavers? And then also, the second question I had is, I mean, it's very clear that that piece is an item of prestige, but was it considered to be a high art, or was it considered to be a craft?
Sorry, can I also just clarify? When you say that silk, do you mean the Oliva Studenica silk or the cushion cover? The Oliva, yeah. I will go back to that. So, for the Ottoman cases with the things like the cushion covers with lengths of velvets, the court records tell us, you know, they name the weavers in the cases where we have them, and they're almost always men. We know from other sources that women did other tasks like reeling, for instance, so fair play. For the Studenica silk, there is just zero documentation, I think, that we're going to be able to find. If we, however, sort of take what people have often argued about the weaving of this, right? So I'm setting weaving sort of aside, that it's something that happens in a workshop, that it takes 5 years of training as well. People have long assumed that it is mostly men because these kinds of tasks do not fit neatly around domestic labor, which most women in the period would have been required to undertake. That 5 years of training and the workshop setting, again, we tend to think that precludes usually the participation of women who are not involved in most kinds of workshop production. Now, we may find that we're not quite right about that. We will see. But again, in the cases where we know we have attached weavers' names, again, to sort of this high level of production, it's over and over again men's names. However, even over having men's names over and over, that's about 10 total. So, there's room for an exception or two, I would hope. Now, is this an item of prestige? Oh, yes, absolutely. So this, it's huge, first of all, right? It would have been really expensive. And this is what people commission. It is absolutely showy. It's my opinion, it was some kind of a hanging, maybe a canopy used by the Sultan, to place behind him when he's receiving visiting dignitaries. So really important, part of his visual program as well, right? This is not a time or a place where we have large-scale oil painting, for instance, which you might think would be another object of prestige. Now, whether this was an art or a craft, I'm going to sort of leave it, but maybe suggest a little bit that, that's a 21st century question, or maybe a 19th century question to some extent. I'm not sure what kind of distinctions we might want to make for 1400s. If you look at our Europeanist colleagues, they would tell you, and this is shocking to most of us, that a tapestry, right, a Burgundian tapestry, was far more valued and expensive than an oil painting. So maybe that helps put it in perspective.
I don't know much about this, but I'm curious about when you talk about gold or silver thread, are those threads made of a combination of the metal plus some silk or something to reinforce it, or just pure metal?
Right, yeah, incisive question from the back. There are a couple of answers to this. So sorry, the question was about the composition of the precious metal threads. And there are a couple of different ways to make these metal threads. So in East Asia, it's metal that's been, I guess, sort of, I don't quite know how to do it, backed with paper. In fact, so that's East Asia. In parts of Central Asia, it's metal on an animal substrate, so that's leather or gut. We can see this coming out of sort of Eastern Iran to some extent, but also eventually Italy. In the Ottoman case, and also some Italian cases, indeed, it is a very thin strip of metal, and in some cases those were cut from big pieces of foil. In some cases they were drawn, and you can tell the difference, and they are wrapped around a silk core. And the alloys depend a little bit. We have silver, and then we have what's called silver gilt, and those can be, sort of a range of quality. I would say different concentrations of precious metal. For the student needs to still, I'll sort of give you a preview. I did have some analysis done on this, and it's a pretty high proportion of precious metal in both the gold and the silver. But there are special workshops for all of this stuff by the time we get to the 1500s and 1600s. It's another specialized craft.
I've been long curious about the terminology. Is there a difference between lampas and samit or brocade?
Oh, wow. That's a specialized question. Thank you. So the question was about the differences between lampas, samite or samit, and brocade. Now, so textile enthusiasts, you know that brocade is a little bit of a general word. It refers to just, we usually think of it as a luxury fabric that is weft-faced, right? Where we mostly see the weft that makes the pattern, but it's not very precise. So samite might be called a kind of brocade. So might taqueté, which is a French word for something similar to a samite, but bound in a different order. Lampas, by contrast, and I'm going to go forward. Lampas, by contrast to samite, uses two sets of warps like samite, but also two sets of wefts as well. Okay, so they are different. Samite was used, you probably know this better than I do, in Byzantium, in Italy, in some Islamic contexts, but lampas seems to emerge mostly in an Islamic context. This is research of my colleague Louise Mackey, sometime maybe in the 1100s, maybe in Iraq. Lampas itself is a general term, again meaning, the way I define it, any fabric with two sets of warps, two sets of wefts, but the binding systems of those can be different. So it's often twill satin, but it can be twill or twill plain weave. Okay, I think does that bring us to the end of our time? So thank you so much again, and for the questions.